everyone. Welcome to Tales from the L&D Bookshelf. I am your host, David Kelly, and I am thrilled to be joined today by our Karl Kapp, author of the new book, Action First Learning. Karl, thanks so much for joining us here.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very
So I
excited to
know,
be part of your initial launch. So this is
yeah, this
very
is going to be
exciting.
fun. We're trying something different here. I appreciate your excitement on that. I also appreciate your willingness to join me while we work out some bugs, which we've just been doing behind the scenes here. So appreciate that. So Karl, you've been in the industry for a while. You've written a number of great books. We're going to talk about your latest right now. But for any of the viewers on the off chance they're not familiar with you and your work, can you just tell us a little bit about what you do, how you do it, and the contributions that you make, and what inspired you to write your new book, Action First Learning?
Yeah, so my day job is as a professor of instructional design and technology at Commonwealth University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, and I teach graduate students to design, develop, and deliver online instruction. And then I do a lot of consulting and writing, and I got fascinated a few years ago about intentional learning with gamification, game-based learning. So did a bunch of work on that, and then gamification led into micro learning, so I did some work on that, and into action first learning. And the idea behind action first learning was the working title was originally beyond gamification. And what I wanted to do was get people to really think about having the learners do something meaningful without the trappings of, I don't like gamification, or
Mhm.
game's a four-letter word, or we can't have that in our organization. So I wanted to move beyond that, and I want to say, look, forget about the names and the labels and all that kind of stuff. Let's just focus on what we want the learner to do, because we know that when the learners do things, they retain the knowledge better, they learn more effectively, they actually have fun doing it. And so that was kind of the focus of action first learning.
Is there anything, if you think about the arc of everything that you've done, the books that you've read, I know you said the labels aren't important, but it is a label that we don't often hear. That's a pretty unique title in our industry, in an industry that's full of buzzwords. Is there anything that evolved that you saw that has kind of led to this focus on the word action?
Yeah, so I mean, there's activity-based learning and there's problem-based learning.
Hmm.
The issues with that, like being in academia, is activity-based learning has a very specific definition. And so if you're in academia and you don't follow that definition, people are like, that's not activity-based learning, or that's not problem-based learning, or so I wanted to create a term that was more of a philosophy, more of a view of the world. And so action first came to mind because I wanted people to, for a number of reasons. One is to think about activities and actions, but two, I also wanted it to be a mantra for how you should start. And
Hmm.
way too many times we start instruction by, droning on with learning objectives, or putting up walls of text before you get into your e-learning course and all that kind of stuff. And the problem is that sets the tone for the learners. So right away they get the message that I need to be a passive learner. And then, halfway through or toward the end, we throw some kind of activity at them. And that's when they resist. They're like, yeah, I'm not going to do this. This is a waste of my time. But basically, an object at rest tends to stay at rest until acted on by some kind of force. And in the end of the instruction or the middle, that force just isn't strong enough. So if we move people to action in the beginning, we excite them, engage them, get them going, then they're going to have that high energy level throughout all of the instruction. So that was kind of the idea behind action first learning. I wanted people to do something first, the learners do something, and then react to that, and then we can do that. And one other piece that fit in, and it kind of all came together, is Malcolm Knowles, who coined the term andragogy, talked about adult learners learn best when they know they don't know something. And so a lot of times I think our job is to help those learners know they don't know something. So putting them in a situation where they have to apply knowledge that they think they know. Learners are really bad, notorious at being able to judge how well they actually know something. And so putting them in a situation where they have to apply it and try it and then find out, ooh, I don't know this, makes them much more open and much more malleable in terms of getting the instruction across. It brings down some defenses and creates some self-awareness in the learner that's not always there.
So it's interesting you closing on the self-awareness piece because there's a piece of the self-awareness that I think is we have to be mindful of the self-awareness of the people that we're supporting, but also our own self-awareness. And I'm hearing as I'm listening to you, and it inspires me to some of the stuff that is kind of the stories that you share in the book. there's our mindset as well. And some of the stuff that you were describing, I found myself thinking like, yeah, but if we don't start thinking about our work differently, we're never going to see these opportunities in front of us because we have such a mechanical, sometimes we have a mechanical production based mindset of what our role should be. What are some of the things, stories from the book or anything that you've had that have helped you build the mindset to see your work through this lens?
Yeah, I think one of the experiences, and unfortunately we've all had this, is sitting in a class where an instructor drones on and on and on about content, and you're contemplating, if I jump out that window, am I going to die or I'm just going to break some bones, right? Because it's so boring. Or, hey, that guy cutting the lawn, that looks like a fantastic job right now. It's just all these experiences really numb our mind to the opportunity to learn. And then you
Yeah.
look at kids, how eager they are and how anxious they are and how curious they are. And we've kind of sucked that out of some learning. I love science and the scientific method, but I think applying the scientific method to instruction has kind of taken some of the humanity out of it.
Mhm.
And in an age of AI that we're living in, if we don't inject that humanity back into the instruction, then what are we doing? Like, how are we impacting people? And so I think that my history in terms of seeing the excitement when people play games, seeing the development of my own children and others in terms of their curiosity, seeing the results of really bad instruction and bad lectures, and saying, look, there's a better way to do this. And the irony is, or I don't know if it's irony or not, but we know how to do this, right? There's been decades of research on the effectiveness of activities for learning and having people do something in terms of retention and recall. But what happens is, to your point, we get in this production mode. We start producing content because someone tells us this has to be covered or this has to be done. And so we cover it, but do we actually learn it? And I would argue no. Oftentimes, just cursory going over some slides or some e-learning, we're not really learning at a deep level. And deep learning is what makes people experts, is what makes people effective at their job. It's what makes people able to think out of the box, right? So if you only know the four corners of the box and you're shaky about what those corners are, you're not going to venture outside the box. You're going to stay right there because you don't want to cause any waves, or you're not quite sure that's the right thing to do or what's not the right thing to do. You become very timid. So I think if we can get people to learn at a deeper level through action and activity, not for activity's sake, but for the sake of doing something. And most jobs are about doing something, right? Very few employers want you to sit there and think. They want you to do something. And so that was also the impetus. Like, let's think about doing something. That helps the employer, it helps the employee, and it ultimately helps us.
One of the things that I like about the book is a lot of what you're discussing, it takes a very practical approach in the book. And there's a lot of case studies which I want to talk about in a minute, but there's also kind of a framework that you've provided within here. Can you tell us a little bit about that framework and what inspired it and some of the thought that went behind the framework?
Yeah, so the idea, so there's a couple of things that go into that. One, as you indicated before, I've written a number of books, and every time I write a book, somebody doesn't like something. Like, oh, this book is great, but has no case study. Oh, this book is good, but it has no framework. Oh, this good book is. So not only is this a culmination of ideas I've had around how to create effective instruction, but it also culminates in what I know about writing a good book. So one of the things that I've learned over the years is to help people implement ideas in books or ideas in general is to have a framework. So the framework is the action first learning framework. And I put that in for a couple reasons. One, so people have an outline, and two, is because I list 9 action first learning approaches in the book, but there's much more than 9. Like, it would be naive or hubris of me to think, oh, I've captured all of them. So I wanted to give people an opportunity to make more. So the first framework, some kind of trigger action. Like, you come into the learning event and right away you have to do something. Maybe you get asked a question, you're given a dilemma, you have a situation, you got to do something right away. Then maybe the learner doesn't even know like what to do and they struggle and try to figure out a little bit. So underneath that, like, so that can be like making a decision, playing a game, those kind of things, trigger event. Then in the next step in the framework is the application of knowledge. So now this trigger event has happened. You've been asked a question, you've been confronted with the dilemma. Now you have to do something. And the process of doing it, you get feedback and you might get instruction. You might socially interact with others. You might become frustrated or angry or upset. And all of that is part of the learning process. Again, I think we miss the affective domain a lot. And we also underestimate the power of frustration. But I say necessity is the mother of invention, but I think it's frustration is the mother of invention, right? We're frustrated that something's not working right, something's not going right. And so we kind of do that. So that creates the moment of need for learning because you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I need to know to do this. And now you're very open and receptive to learning. And then, so you go through that process and you learn. That's where instruction comes in. And I'm not anti-lecture. Certainly, once you have the moment of need, you may need to lecture a little bit or you may need to describe a little bit. It's just that our paradigm is so far over on the lecture side, it needs to move to the action side. And then the last element is reflection. I always say there's no learning experience without reflection. There's just an experience. So we need to have the learners experience something. So if you look, there's a trigger action, there's the application of knowledge, and then there's a reflection. And that's the framework in which action first learning occurs.
So you touched on the fact that you cover about 9 of these different examples in the book. There's a lot of different ones, a lot of variety within there. Some of my favorites in there are the card games and the escape rooms, things of that sort. What is it about some of the experiences that you explore in the book that lend itself towards this action first learning framework that you're describing?
Yeah, so I wanted to do two things with that. One was I wanted to show that no matter, because people always say, well, I don't have money for VR. Well, so I can't do whatever. Well, guess what? You can do a card game. And guess what? You can go to the Staples and buy index cards or use Post-it notes to make card games. So I wanted to encompass the whole gamut from analog all the way to high digital, metaverse or virtual reality. And what all of these have in common is they can get the learner doing something right away. So if you have a card game, for example, maybe you're talking about insurance claims and you want the learners to sort this claim is valid or invalid. Now, if you work for a lot of insurance companies, they're all invalid, but let's pretend there's some valid insurance claims. So you could have them sorting something right away. If you went into a world of virtual reality, you could put the person at an accident scene right away. And now they have to maybe take some action to save somebody or maybe move away the crowd before the car catches on fire or whatever it happens to be. But now you're doing something right away. You're involved right away. We've got the learner's attention, whether it's a card game, whether it's an escape room where you have to, get out of a situation or solve a puzzle to do something in that area, or even a virtual reality. So I wanted to have the whole gamut. And what's in common among all those things is some type of action or activity that the learner is able to take right away when they engage in that learning experience.
So some of the examples that you go into the book do explore that techie side that you were just talking about. There's some AR examples, there's some AI examples in there as well. When you think about some of the tech that's there, that's kind of the double-edged sword of it's exciting because there's all this opportunity, but there's also risk and disruption attached to that. What excites you about the opportunities that are in the augmented, well,
Yeah, so if we think about, the book has a little bit about, AI agents or AI coaches. And what excites me about that is if we think about probably the most effective learning model ever is the journeyman apprentice model. The only problem with that is it's not scalable. In fact, Bloom of the famous Bloom's taxonomy has a very interesting study, Two Sigma problem. Bloom did a study that found out that students who were tutored did Two Sigmas better than students who were broadcast instruction. But it was not scalable. One of the things I think that technology is going to be able to do for us is scale that one-on-one model. Now, it has to be done right, and then you combine that with like deliberate practice or desirable difficulties, and you can give a person real-time, helpful feedback on what they're doing, right? A camera can watch me try to fix a piece of machinery and can give me feedback. A recording can tell me how well I dealt with a subordinate who wanted another extra day off. Like I can now start to get all these levels of feedback specific to what I'm doing. And not only that, but it can also give me all these levels of practice. So I can practice doing it over and over again. I always say, I want the pilot that's flying me to London, for example, to have been in a flight simulator. That's important to me. But I don't want the pilot's only experience to have been in the flight simulator. I want him or her to actually have flown an airplane as well, without the simulation. And this is what I think these technologies do for us. They up us on the practice curve, on the experience curve. They don't finish us, though. We need to go to finishing school still. To fly that plane a few times to England before I feel really comfortable. The dentist needs to work on real teeth before I feel really comfortable. So it can help minimize that learning curve. I was talking to some people in pharma, and they do certification of pharma reps. Like they have these big POA meetings. And one person said, yeah, there's a line out the door of reps who have to get certified. And sometimes they think they know it, but they don't. And they come back. But now they can practice and practice and practice with this new technology. They can get it right. Then when they go to certify with an actual human, it's a very quick, relatively painless process. And that, I think, is what excites me about those technologies.
So a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of you need both the practical framework and the practical approaches to put this in place, as well as the mindset. Both you need both of them in order to really harness this opportunity as L&D professionals. You've been working with L&D departments all around the world for a long time. Where do you see the gaps? Where do you see people hitting the wall where they make the mistake and like they default rather than exploring this better approach?
Issues that cause that. Without being overly controversial, I think one of the issues is a lot of people become accidental instructional designers. And a lot of accidental instructional designers do a phenomenal job. But they don't always have the grounding in the theory that's outside, that's growing or that's becoming new or that's outside of what push the field forward. Academic institutions, I mean, their faculty members, they research these things, they apply these things, they test them. They're really on the cutting edge. A lot of people think academia is behind, but it's actually on the cutting edge of what's happening in the field, given the right program and all that kind of stuff. So I think one is the lack of knowledge of where this field is going. I think another one is convenience or ease. It's a lot easier to take a regulation that was put out by the government, fancy it up in some PowerPoint, add a couple of questions, and boom, you've got instruction. I think the third is the organization. Learning and development doesn't often push back on the organization. So the organization will say, we need this training tomorrow morning before breakfast. And yeah, I can produce it, but is the learner going to know it tomorrow morning before breakfast? Probably not. So sometimes we need to push back on that. And then also the learners, when you put a learner, so there's been some really interesting research that shows for activity-based learning, learners in that situation will report that they've actually learned less than they do in a lecture. So you give them, and you ask them, did you learn more or less than traditional instruction? So we learned a lot less. Then you test them on it, finds out they learned a lot more. So again, learners are bad judges of like what they've actually learned, but sometimes they can be very vocal to their managers and their bosses about what they didn't learn. And so, we spent all time doing some kind of activity. It was a waste of time, and they're not realizing that they actually learned the content. Then the other issue is, and I don't know the way around this, but a lot of adult learners in companies feel like they know everything. Like if you talk to a salesperson, they don't want to go to sales practice, right? Because I'm a salesperson. I know what I'm doing. I don't need any practice. But look at like Tom Brady. Tom Brady, arguably one of the best quarterbacks ever. He went to practice like all the time. He was the first one there, the last one to leave. Why is Tom Brady going to practice? Because he knows that he can always get better and improve. And that sports mentality, some reason, doesn't always translate into organizational performance or efficiency or effectiveness. So I think there's that kind of like, I don't want to do anything. I just tell me the information. You leave me alone. I leave you alone and we're all good. And while that on the surface works, innovative organizations don't work like that. Organizations that are at the prime of what they're doing don't work like that. So it's a mindset that we're up against all the time. And I think, and that's part of the reason why I wrote the book, like here's a roadmap for working against that mindset that can help you move to the next level. And again, you don't have to do it all at once. You can chip away and slowly turn the boat in the direction we want to go.
So I want to connect a couple of dots in what you're describing because I'm listening to you talk about like people don't always know what they learned or they report it poorly, and some of the stuff that you're talking about how people perform, like it comes back to this theme of reflection that's built into your framework that sometimes in order to develop the awareness around that, you have to reflect on the experience to connect those dots and get that deep learning you're talking about. And the ironic part that's always existed for me is that a lot of us know the importance of reflection as learning professionals, but we don't prioritize it in our own work as well as we should. And you built it into the framework, which is one of the reasons that I like that so much. But how do we not lose sight of that? How do we make sure that we're prioritizing the reflection where a lot of those dots can be connected?
That's a great question. Let me reflect on that. I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to build that into the instruction. And so that is why it's in the framework is, and every chapter, talks about how to develop it. And at the end says build in reflection. The other thing is we don't know so what does that mean, right? When we say we want you to reflect on this. And if we don't guide that reflection, the learners might not reflect in the way that we want them to. So we want to ask them pointed questions. So for example, what did you learn today that you can apply to your work environment? What are going to be the obstacles when you apply it? What aha moments did you have? What were some realizations that you hadn't fully thought about before? What are some directions that you want to go in now that you know this information? So we need to put together, depending on the subject matter and learners that you have, a series of reflective questions. And I think one of the great things that we can do, and again, we rarely do this, is provide students at the beginning of an instructional experience a reflective journal, encouraging them to write in the journal. We can even seed it with some of these reflective questions that we have, or at least give them the questions, or at least debrief it. And then now with the technology, I can send you back to work. And a week later, I can send you a little message. Hey, Dave, in class, we learned about this. Can you reflect on a few minutes of how it's working in your daily operations and what's lacking? And this way we can prompt people to continually reflect. One of the things that happens is we're all in very lean organizations and we're go and we think go is really good, and we think, taking time reflection is really bad. But it's kind of like the design process of instructional design, right? If you just developed, you might develop garbage. If you stop and design it and then develop it, it may seem like it takes longer, but it's actually more effective. And so in our daily lives and the lives of the learners, if we can give them permission to reflect, time and space to reflect, actually the learning is going to be more effective and you're going to be a better instructor or a better designer than if you hadn't built in any reflection.
I'm going to continue that theme in our last section here, and I'm going to ask you to reflect a little bit on some of the stuff that you've done. And now, the first question: your new book is fairly new, so you can answer this in the context of a new book or any previous books. But you're a prolific author. You've written a number of books. Has there ever been are there anything that surprised you when you write a book? Something that maybe someone's reacted to it differently, other than the criticisms that come out that you mentioned earlier, or applied insights in a way that maybe you hadn't considered when you thought about it, like something that surprised you as an author after your book has gone out to the world.
So actually, one of the things about this book, one of my first interviews was a former student of mine, now a colleague named Mark Burke, and he always talks about a model of thinking. So he spends a lot of time teaching people to think about their own thinking. And he said, action first learning is a 3-word model for thinking. And I'm like, I never thought of that. What do you mean? He goes, well, action is something that you need to do, but you need to do that first and then you can learn. And he's like, so oftentimes we spend a lot of time thinking, and then we hope that will lead to learning. But he's like, you kind of created a model where you're thinking and acting at the same time then leads to this learning experience rather than thinking and then action. So I thought that was kind of an interesting revelation for me and an interesting way of thinking about what it really spawned for me was, and I should have known this, but when you write a book, you have a certain thought like, oh, people should interpret it this way. And then when people interpret it a little bit differently, you're like, wow, I never thought that's a really good interpretation of what I wrote. Wow, that's pretty good. And it's not really me, it's how they decide through their lens and their experience to interpret the elements that you write and that's always an interesting experience for me. The one experience that's kind of funny is I wrote a book a long time ago called Winning E-Learning Proposals. So it was about how to write a proposal. I think 2003. I used it in class, and every once in a while I had a student come up and say, and they do something in their proposal. I'm like, why in the world did you do this? And they said, well, on page 14 of your book, you said that. And I'm like, but that's not what I meant. So it's just interesting, the different interpretations of what you write. You think it's black and white, you think it makes sense, but everybody brings their own lens to what you write, which is kind of exciting, but also a little bit like, okay, now I have to be more specific about this, or I have to be more specific about that, just to make sure that what I'm trying to say actually gets across.
You mentioned books from 2003. We've been in the field for a while. What do you feel is the most transformative change that you've witnessed that has affected how you practice as an
Yeah,
L&D?
that's a good question. And you keep beating around like you've been in the field for a while. You can just say that I'm old. But
I can say that because I'm probably older, so that's
right,
fine.
exactly. Someone said, like, how do you know so many people? I said, just attrition, right? Just it's not any magic. But so I think the interesting thing about the field to me is, well, two things. One is that we're starting. So when e-learning first came out, we made the huge mistake in the field of taking broadcast classroom learning and just broadcasting it online. Like that was kind of, and we never got to the personalization that we needed to get to. And so I think we're now starting to get to the tools with AI and some of those other tools that can allow it to be very personalized and very specific to what we need to learn. So I think that's an interesting change in the industry. The other change I think in the industry is that it's definitely more people are aware and talking about the research behind what we do. And I think that's been an important trend as well. And then the final trend that I think is very important is the accessibility. For years, we created instruction not thinking about accessibility. Now it's in the forefront of most of our minds. In fact, I have a chapter in the book on accessibility because people always ask me, well, how do you make an escape room accessible or a card game accessible? So I spent some time talking about that. It's not definitive, but there's definitely some good content in there. And those changes, I think, are really impacting the industry. And then the final change, and we talked about this before, is what is happening to courses? I think they're disappearing, and it's going to be really interesting to see. There's a whole host of things that could replace them, so it'd be interesting to see where that goes.
Carl, for our last question, I want to shift gears from you as an author to you as a reader. For this little series that I'm putting together here, I'm looking up at my bookshelf, pulling off books that have been influential to me, authors that I think have great insights. What are some books that you would recommend, books that have been important in your career that you would recommend people consider reading?
So one of the books that really made a huge impact on me was by Tom Peters called Circle of Innovation, and it's subtitled "You Can't Shrink Your Way to Greatness." And so in my formative corporate years, Tom Peters was huge. And the cool thing about that book is I forget, but I think on the left hand side are like his notes, and the right hand side were slides or a version of what his slide would be. And so you could actually hear Tom Peters, or I could hear Tom Peters like talking what was going on the left and then seeing the images on the right. And I think that was really kind of influential to me. And there's a quote in one of Tom Peters' presentations that said, by Mario Andretti, that said, if everything seems under control, you're just not going fast enough. And I found a lot of comfort in that quote because nothing ever seems in control, whether it's kids or work or whatever. And so that's kind of an interesting take on it. So I found a lot of his work. I mean, In Search of Excellence was an early book I read, which was influential to me as well. So Tom Peters' work, and as he becomes older, I think people lose sight of some of the work that he's done. And I think it's really important. And then new books like Josh Cavalier has a book about AI and learning and development. So I got the privilege of reading that and hopefully doing a testimonial for that. So that's really kind of interesting as well. So those kinds of, from a business perspective, I mean, Tom Peters was talking about building your own brand before LinkedIn was even a thought. And so he was so much on the forefront of what was happening in business and industry that it really caught my attention.
Carl, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. Tell us where we can find the book, more information on the book, and how to follow all the great work that you do.
So yeah, so the book can be found at finer booksellers, and I would think some not so fine booksellers as well. I just think that's a funny phrase, but it's on Amazon, ATD. You can buy it at Barnes and Noble, Target. I even had somebody get it at Walmart, like ordered it on Walmart. So it's not in the store in Walmart, but you can order it through their website, which is probably driven by Amazon or something like that. But so you can get that anywhere. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I have a newsletter, LinkedIn Easter eggs, which is a lot of fun. And I try to write research informed articles in there talking about kind of where things are going. You can follow me on YouTube. Some of the book content, I actually have YouTube videos to kind of help people apply it. I really wanted this book to be about application. It's research informed, but it's not an academic heavy read. It's like, we're doing this because research says this is a good idea, and this is kind of how it's working. So I think that answered your question.
It definitely did, and I think that the book is proof of what you just described there. I encourage everyone to check it out if you haven't done so already. Karl, thanks so much for joining us here for our very first edition here of Tales from the L&D Bookshelf.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be on the inaugural podcast. So thank you, Dave.
Thank you.